Ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, dear researchers, I'm especially delighted to welcome today the Institute Professor Diane Amann. She didn't arrive today, she arrived a few days ago to have a research stay at the Institute, and I'm delighted to have her here as a guest, and she has very kindly accepted to deliver a lecture on a topic which is at the heart of her research, which is women at the Nuremberg trials. It is a topic which is, of course, especially timely, as the lecture takes place on the 7th of March, so just the day before the Women's Day, so it's a good time to speak about this topic. And we are also delighted with the topic because we opened a kind of cycle last fall when welcoming Philip Sands for a lecture on this book, Script. And so we go on discussing about this very important topic. It turns out that I met Diane something like 20 years ago now, I'm going to say. And it was because Diane was collaborating with Maher, and for a lot of reasons, among which you find the fact that they both focus on criminal law, but also the fact that they have been both very interested for a long time into the evolution of international law, about the evolution of articulation between legal orders, the reflection on intersystemic relationship, legal relationship. And so Diane has been also working on all these issues for decades. I should also say that Diane is currently chair in international at the University of Georgia School of Law. She has been vice dean of this law faculty. We've had some exchange on management, and but also, of course, head of the Center of Research, the Dean Rusk International Law Center. And she is also currently, I have to say, the special advisor on children in and affected by armed conflict near the Prosecutor of the International Criminal Court. And so, and she has also an active role in international criminal justice, and it gives you an idea of the range of her competence. I will not go more in depth into her biography, but just to tell again the pleasure that I have to have her here at the Institute. We tried it last year, it failed, but this year it's, we succeeded in having her before she goes to Oxford to go on with her research on this very important topic. And we are very lucky as well because tomorrow she has accepted to share her experience regarding this research project with the researchers of my department, and I'm sure it will be also a very fruitful conversation. But for now, I will have the floor to speak about women at the Nuremberg trials.
Thank you so much, Hélène. It is so good to see you and to visit you in your home here in Luxembourg. I want to thank everyone from the Institute. All of you have been so gracious to me and to my husband, Professor O'Neill, who is shadow visiting. We are en route to Oxford, where he'll be doing a formal visit and also teaching in our university study abroad program there. I'd like to present my research in its current state, talk a little bit about how I got here, what I'm looking at, and I look very, very much forward to your comments and questions. I'd like to begin with the claim that post-World War II international criminal justice owes much to accounts by men at Nuremberg. Men who were judges, lawyers, defendants, not only in the trial of the major war criminals conducted by the 4 victorious Allied powers, but also in the dozen or so subsequent trials carried out by the US occupiers. We might even extend that to some of the trials in the other occupation zones immediately after World War II. The accounts also surface in popular culture, and perhaps the most well-known of these is a movie called Judgment at Nuremberg. I could have given you also movie posters of this particular film in German and French and in many other languages. It has had a good long run since it was released in 1961. Like many of the accounts of the Nuremberg trials, it features shrewd and handsome American heroes, all of them men. There are very few women. This account in some ways may be more egalitarian than others because you see here both Marlene Dietrich and also Judy Garland. But the roles that they play are very emblematic of the roles that are given to women in the few circumstances in which they are talked about in this context. Dietrich, as you may remember, plays the love interest of the heroic American judge, Spencer Tracy. She has not much other role except to be his romantic foil in that movie. Judy Garland, in one of what I think is one of her most powerful roles, one of her last roles, plays a victim, a Gentile German woman who was convicted before the People's Courts in Nazi Germany for an illicit relationship with a Jewish man, contrary to the Nuremberg laws. The nature of that so-called illicit relationship was that he was her landlord, significantly older than she, and they were reported by a denouncing witness once to have been seen with her sitting on his lap. For that presumed offense, she was thrown in jail and he was executed. And she plays an amazing role talking about that. But she is playing the role of the woman as victim, which, as we were just discussing with the gentleman from Shoah, is one of the few roles that we see women in contemporary, or excuse me, popular accounts. My project is to undercut that, to explore that, to excavate whether there were women involved in this era, what they did, and to try to identify women, not only the romantic women, not only the victims, but to try to create an account of the roles that women played at Nuremberg. I'm undertaking the project in something of an unusual way, perhaps. To date, the center of my research is based on oral history videos that I had spent the month of January watching, as well as some other times online, at the University of Southern California Shoah Foundation, which has a video library of 56,000 two-hour oral histories of people who have memories in one way or another of the post-war and Holocaust periods. Included in that are many people who played roles in the various war crimes trials, including women who, to date, have been largely anonymous. The Imperial War Museum in London is another source for similar videos. It's permitting me to essentially interview or harvest from interviews of individuals, all of whom now have been dead for a decade or longer, to find out what their impressions were about their roles, this project, etc. Personal papers of these individuals are starting to become available. Not surprisingly, many of them died in, say, the 2000 to 2010 era. Their children went up in the attic and discovered boxes labeled Nuremberg and had no idea what to do with them. And so they have found their ways to archives, both large and small, and I've had the opportunity to look at some of them, indeed a couple of them before they've even been donated. After that, there are the usual government archives, official documents, judicial decisions, and memoirs. All of them, as we'll see, with the exception of one, written by men at Nuremberg. What I'm trying to do is to figure the role of women into the Nuremberg trials narrative and hope that with it, we learn larger stories of 20th century Europe, 20th century United States, World War II, the Holocaust, etc. Let me give you an example of how this may play out. This document is known as the Wannsee Protocol of the Endlösung. Please forgive my German. Endlösung is German for the final solution, the Endlösung der Judenfrage, the final solution of the Jewish question. This is a document that exists only in one copy, although there were some 24 made initially. It was discovered in early 1947, after the principal Nuremberg trial had concluded, but it became a significant document in the subsequent trials and indeed in Holocaust and World War II history since then. The story of how this document was discovered was recounted in 2012 in a German broadcast, which I will quote in brief in translation. The broadcast says, files from the German office arrived at the Nuremberg Palace of Justice office of this man, Dr. Robert Kempner, from a transit camp in Berlin. In the stacks was a thick package with the inscription D, which stood for the German Department of this ministry. Kempner and his co-workers opened the bundle and were excited to discover a protocol on this document. He barely trusted his eyes, Kempner did, and Kempner asked, is that really real? In accounts like this, Kempner is the hero who first sees and instantly recognizes the document that will change the course of the trials and indeed history. In fact, both his New York Times obituary and an account that remains on the website of the Holocaust Museum in the United States credit him alone with the discovery of this protocol. As the broadcast observed at the end, quote, as impressive as Kempner's account is, it does not have to be true. And perhaps it is not. At least not in full. What we see here is Kempner's lifelong research associate and assistant, a Pennsylvania-born woman named Jane Lester, whom all agree was the person who first translated this document upon its discovery from German into English. She worked with him throughout her life, and she remained single, and he remained married to another woman. And in 1996, she tells us in a Shoah interview when she was 80 years old about the finding of this document. She says, it was an English girl, Betty Richardson. She was in Berlin going through some of the files, and she found this. And she called up and said, this is very startling. Well, what does Betty Richardson have to say? Betty Richardson, in an interview in 2002 in Der Spiegel, says, actually, Kenneth Duke found it. He brought it to me. I confirmed its importance and called Dr. Kempner. Kempner asked me to fly to Nuremberg with the document, which I did. So it couldn't have been a surprise when it arrived at Nuremberg, nor was Kempner the first one to realize its significance. What we learn then is we have a woman who is involved in the discovery, as well as a man, that they are both British and not American. Would it interest you to know that she is in some ways a spy, and that she had spent World War II as an intelligence officer for the British Navy, intercepting U-boat signals? And that was why she was both Kenneth Duke's supervisor and recognized the significance of the document. Well, so what, might you say? Why does it matter that there were women at Nuremberg? I'd like to make the claim that it's interesting that there were women, that we don't know that there were women. There were even women in supervisory roles, not roles simply stenographers, as the assumption might have been, that they came to Nuremberg with a range of experiences, including sophisticated experiences as accomplished government lawyers, as intelligence officers, code breakers, etc. That they were not just American, but British and from many other nationalities. All of those facts blow holes into the standard account emblematic in the judgment at Nuremberg. This interest of mine corresponds with what is currently called a turn in international law toward history. There's been a lot of conferences and writings about this recently. It is an interdisciplinary convergence, as we see occasionally in the law, of law and history, historiography, the story of the story, how stories get constructed, the fact that there is not one history, but many histories, the interest in critical studies and elsewhere in what's called history from below. What if these were all people of the same gender? Would we not get interesting stories from understanding how the subordinates experienced an event vis-a-vis the people in the hierarchy, who are those who today written the story of Nuremberg? Memory studies, and in my own field, international criminal law, there's intense interest in these concepts of legacy of international criminal justice. I'm very interested as well, as the more and more I look into this, into a question that I haven't seen addressed very much in symposia. What matters in the legal process? When we talk about Nuremberg, we immediately want to talk about the trial. And I'm very struck that many of the interviewers, as the witnesses wander off and talk about, oh, how difficult it was to work with translation machines, how hard it was to make 26 copies without a photocopy machine. Can you imagine? If anyone has ever worked on carbon copies and a manual typewriter? A few of us may be old enough to have done that. It is monumentally difficult. What it was like to be in a place with no heat, with no running water sometimes, without any kinds of mod-cons or creature comforts, and yet be expected to do this work. For the participants, the interrogations were the most interesting part of the Nuremberg project. They were free-ranging. If any of you has done a deposition where you get to ask all kinds of questions, whether they're succinctly relevant to the trial or not, that can often be much more interesting. You get much more detail, you get the unvarnished account, you get to cross-examine and push, etc. Almost all of the participants at this level found that much more interesting. The description of the trial from everybody, including the prosecutors, and certainly the journalists, was it was incredibly boring. It was essentially the after the fact, the staging of what had been scripted before. And so what I'm finding as I go through this are real questions about what law is and what law matters. This aspect of Nuremberg has seldom been discussed. And as I've said, the interviews were kept trying to get people back on the important stuff. They say, yes, but what did Goering look like in the courtroom? And you could hear the witnesses saying, that wasn't what was interesting. What was interesting was this thing that happened over here. So I haven't quite theorized through this, but I think it's an important aspect of the project. I also say I'm discovering more and more about the contingency of history. That whenever we make an account, and this is also true of a trial when we purport to come to a verdict that is something like the truth, we may well be getting it wrong, or it may be only today's account, and we have to be open for the changes. Just by way of example, in the anecdote that I just gave you, the first two times that I have talked about this with folks, I claimed that Betty Richardson was not only an intelligence officer, but that she had been a code breaker at Bletchley Park. If any of you is familiar with that, that's where the major code breaking in Britain was. It's become sort of an iconic thing to have been one of the thousands of secret workers at Bletchley Park that helped break the German code and win the war. Well, it turns out there was a Betty Richardson at Bletchley Park, and she did much the same thing. But in correspondence with Bletchley, I am now fairly persuaded it's not the same person. I guess that's a fairly common British name. So there were two women with the same name doing roughly the same thing. One was in Bletchley Park, one was maybe in London. Right? So I was wrong on that in those accounts. It turns out that the Welt broadcast that portrays the memoirs of Dr. Kempner as being incredibly self-aggrandizing may also be false. I have finally, just in the last few days, got hold of the memoir, which is available only in German in very few libraries, and gone through it. And in fact, in the account that I have read, he does give credit to his co-workers. He relates the story about the phone call, although he does not name Betty Richardson. And he credits by name Jane Lester for translating the document. And so maybe he wasn't quite as chauvinistic or self-aggrandizing as we believe. And so what purported to be in the document that I read, a verbatim quotation from his German memoir, turns out not to have been. So I think we have to always be open to the fact that these stories will change depending on who tells them. In the Shoah interviews, it's quite clear that people's memory 20 or 40 years after the fact is probably quite different than it would have been before. And so that the tellings will differ and the truths will differ. I should also say, this is not just a gender studies project. Right? A lot of folks, anytime you say they're doing anything about women in international law, you get put in the feminist jurisprudence or gender studies box. I have nothing wrong with that box, but that's not where this study belongs. Sex and gender are, of course, important. It's the line that I've drawn. But what I'm finding more and more is it's many other cross-sectional traits that are important in thinking about these folks. Perhaps the trait that's most important, if I had to identify one today, is that they were all members of the victorious side. And that affected the way they saw things more than anything. You see many of the Americans, the assumption is that women would be nurturing and empathetic to the suffering, etc. There's a Boston Robin woman in this story, a lawyer, who writes home and says, I see Germans starving in the street. They deserve what they got. And that's the beginning and the end of her empathy for people starving. It is not universal. I've found some exceptions, but there is very little love lost for the Germans in this period. So the fact that having been on the winning side and feeling that this other group was the cause of all our suffering may have been far more important than whether they were men or women. Religion, of course, may matter, given the ethno-religious nature of persecution during this war. Race and ethnicity, but race perhaps in a broader sense. In those days, they spoke, for instance, of the Jewish race, a term we might not use today, the Irish race, terms we might not use today, but also race in the sense of color line, and I'd like to talk a little bit about that. One would think that Nuremberg was a white project, and I think that's largely true, at least as we tend to understand white today. There are a few exceptions. As you might guess, at the Tokyo trials, there were many more people with some Asian ancestry for linguistic reasons. I've discovered one at Nuremberg. There is a woman named Pilani Ahuna, who turns out to be half Native Hawaiian and half Chinese, and somehow finds her way to Nuremberg, and you see her in the circle there as a court reporter within breathing distance of Hermann Goering. And I would love to find letters or something of her to get a sense of what her experience was, being surely a very unusual figure in this time. I'm also interested by the fact these pictures are from the book by her husband, who was an interpreter. They met at Nuremberg, and he writes a memoir after she's died. You see her in the middle, right there, but you also see there's a black man next to her at a table identified as court reporters from Nuremberg. I do not know who that is or what his story is, but that's of great interest to me as well. There is another color line story that is of interest. This is a picture of the sentencing of Otto Ohlendorf, who was the head of the Einsatzgruppe, the death squads under the Nazi regime. This is a picture I've seen before and really not paid very much attention to, and one of the things I'm learning in this is these accounts are helping me read photographs differently than I would have before. And so here's what one of the women at Nuremberg, Andy, as she called herself, Andy Logan, from the New Yorker, and you see this is also error. I put her New York Times in the slide, but in fact she worked for the New Yorker. In an account that she gives to the Shoah Foundation in her 70s, she remembers this photograph in this moment specifically as she covered it for the New Yorker. And she reminds us that the Einsatzgruppe and the Nazi philosophy thought about supermen, and they were trying to create a race of supermen, of which of course they were the models. And she says, and then we came to the sentencing, and there in the middle were the supermen, and they were rather insignificant looking men. And then she reminds us, at a time when the US Army had not yet desegregated, it did have troops of white and black, but they were not serving together. Nonetheless, she reports, the US Army, the people who were running the trials, had found two very wonderful, strong-looking black men to stand on either side of these men as they were being sentenced. So that I think the point was made with no one saying a word, really. I think I wrote something like, of these black soldiers, quote, they did not, by the faintest change in their expression, betray the dignity of the occasion, but one could not escape the impression that they were very much enjoying their work, unquote. Nationality also is a cross-cutting identity that's important. And I've already made the claim that this was not an American project, and I've just listed here some of the women of nationalities other than the US who were involved. Among those that I've pictured, the woman in the uniform is Barbara Pinion, who also, in fact, was at Bletchley, as well as Gwen Heron Ebergall, also at Bletchley. She's the woman sitting on the folding chair in the middle of the paper. She gives you a great feel for just the immense amount of evidence that they were processing. There is as well a Luxembourg story. There is in, I believe, Mondo-Fleban, there used to be something called the Grand Hotel, which became called the Ashcan because of the way that it was refitted to become the prison where Goering and the other Nazi criminals were held before the trials and interrogated, and among the interrogators was the man in this picture, John Ernst, who later anglicized his name to John Ernest Doliwa, who was a Luxembourg native who had emigrated with his family to the US. And he was involved in those interrogations for months before the trial began, eventually comes back to Luxembourg in the 80s as the US ambassador to Luxembourg. The woman in the picture I owe to Hélène, who sent me this a while back. Her name is Leon Müller. She is identified as someone who was in the Luxembourg army and was part of the war crimes efforts of the British. And I have not found very much about her except for one story, which suggests that she may not have been successful in returning one fugitive accused for trial in Luxembourg, and that may not have been an accident. The former Nazi governor of Nuremberg was Luxembourg was being returned here for trial in Luxembourg and turned up dead before he reached prison. And the suggestion is that she may or may not have been somewhat complicit in that. The last thing that I would say is important in my findings is class, socioeconomic status, education. That plays out in numerous ways. What were your politics? What was your ideology? There were communists, there were liberals, there were conservatives, there were people who were very religious, not very religious, there were people who were animated by what had happened to persecution in camps, there were people who weren't interested in that at all. All of those things can color the roles that people played and the way they played them, experiences as well, what brought you to Nuremberg. One of the people that I've looked into who found her way to Nuremberg as an interpreter is Edith Simon. And she was actually originally a refugee from Germany. She managed to get out of Germany, in her own words, very late, perhaps too late, only because her father was a very wealthy banker in Karlsruhe. And she called it too late because the rest of the community was waiting for him to leave. The rest of the Jewish community. They felt when he left, that would be the signal they all needed to leave. He had set himself up financially to do so. Others in the community found that it was impossible. They left right at the time the Sudetenland was invaded. She goes on to come back to Nuremberg after having earned a degree at Berkeley in California and translated at the San Francisco Conference of the United Nations. And she is the person who then interprets from German into English the historic opening speech of Robert Jackson. We need to remember that the people who did lead the Nuremberg Project were self-consciously engaging in the creation of a historical record. And as she says, in fact, Jackson said, history will not forget what we are doing here. And she reports that while she was translating it, a magazine writer reported about how, quote, the dark-haired interpreter whose voice quavers with the enormity of the situation. She says, well, I didn't quaver because of that, but because I was scared silly at what I was doing. I wasn't very good at interpreting. She also is one who never loses her feelings about Germans who are not Jewish. That stays with her even to the point I think they asked her if she had ever bought a German car, and even at age 75 the answer was no. It extended when she was at Nuremberg to her socialization. She says she did not go to dances at the officers' clubs because German women were involved, and, quote, I wasn't going to compete with the prostitutes, unquote, which seems to be the universal attitude toward German women, true or not, at the time. Sex was rampant at Nuremberg, as one might expect. Lots of very young people, many of whom had been through war and not been with anybody for a very long time. The rule was at Nuremberg that married wives could not be at Nuremberg for security reasons and also for reasons there was very little accommodation, very little food. It was felt that to allow people to bring their dependents would put even more pressure on infrastructure. And so we have Harriet Zetterberg Margolis, who is the only woman lawyer at the first Nuremberg trial. And she worked quite hard at that trial. She was permitted to be there with her husband only by using her maiden name, and in the eyes of everyone in Nuremberg, the couple lived in sin. It was okay for them to live together as unmarried people, but had it become known that they were married, she would have been made to go home. Her husband gives a Shoah interview in which he talks about her experience. She was a much more important lawyer at the trial than he was, and he would be the first to admit it. And he tells us Harriet was assigned to do a brief on Albert Speer, and she was the one who researched it, who culled the evidence, and distilled the case against Albert Speer. However, she was not permitted to present the brief at the trial. I mean, she couldn't appear. She wrote the briefs, but she could not present them in court. Well, those were the days when you didn't consider women taking a very prominent part, which she rather resented. And this is a picture of her sitting next to the man who who had the duty of presenting the brief she had written for it, because she is not permitted to speak herself in the courtroom. Again, a reading, I have seen this picture before. I did not read the resentment in her eyes until I had heard the story. I'm not going to have time to tell you about all the women I want to tell you about, but let me tell you about a couple more and then we'll open up to questions. The star of my story is probably Cecilia Getz. This is because in many ways she was the most prominent, the most recognized by her male peers of the women lawyers at Nuremberg. It is also because she serves the longest time. Many of these folks were in or out in a matter of 4, 6, 8 months. She spends 2 years at Nuremberg. She had been a lawyer for several years during World War II in Washington, I believe in the Department of Justice. She comes to Nuremberg and becomes deeply involved in the Krupp trial. Is perhaps the number 3 lawyer out of 6 or 7 on that trial. Despite her incredible seriousness of purpose, when there is a newspaper article written about her in the New York Sun, notice the amount of leg in that picture. It is, as if you see the story on the right, slip covers made to fit. She is next to a story about upholstery on the women's page. And the story is basically our girl in Nuremberg. And it talks about this gal, and why isn't she home getting married? And interviewing her aunt back in New York who says, we wish she would come home and get married. And she writes, until that story was published, I didn't realize what a freak I was. All because I was a woman attorney, a young woman attorney at Nuremberg. And this is a picture of her giving the opening statement, part of the opening statement in Krupp, the only woman to do an opening statement in the 12 subsequent trials. She never wrote anything about Nuremberg, even though she goes on to an illustrious career, and this also is part of the reason why she's one of my stars. She becomes the first federal bankruptcy judge in New York who is a woman. This interview to the Shoah Foundation is done when she's 80 years old and retired from that position. And they ask her, what was it like to be a woman at Nuremberg? And she says, well, I think being a woman was a disadvantage, which it always is. She gives a wry smile, then she frowns, pauses, appears to be remembering, and then continues. You're a target. You are a target for unwelcome advances. In what sense, the interviewer asks. Oh, she says with a deep sigh, it's hard to document, but it was not a very comfortable thing being a woman in Nuremberg. It wasn't very comfortable being part of a tiny minority. It wasn't very comfortable being part of a minority that was ostracized or deeply ostracized from the rest of the community. Germans or displaced persons weren't supposed to come to our movies. They didn't come to our hotel. So we lived a sort of colonial life in Germany. And I love that phrase because it adds a whole other layer of theorization to what was going on here. We were part of a segregated minority, particularly in the Grand Hotel. So I was part of a minority. And I would add here, of a minority, because although she doesn't mention it, she's also Jewish, which was not universal among these folks. So it was a very unpleasant 2 years. Nuremberg, she continues, was itself in shambles. Restaurants, if there were restaurants, I didn't go to them. They weren't operating. It was a very confined life. So I really had nothing much else to do but work. Fortunately, the work itself was very fascinating and very consuming, so I wasn't at a loss to keep myself occupied. Another woman who is very much a worker and a thinker is Maher. She had been one of the leading lawyers conversant in the economics of the Nazi regime while working in, I believe, the Treasury Department in Washington as a lawyer before coming to Nuremberg. Her husband talks about the degree to which she worked. He says Belle Maher sat on her bottom in her hotel room and wrote the entire indictment in the I.G. Farben trial of over 100 pages. And again, remember writing them either by hand or by manual typewriter, or both. That is not an insignificant contribution to the trial. Her thinking, or her depth of thinking, I think comes through in her papers, which I've not read in detail. They're at Harvard, and I have not yet got there. But some of them have been digitized, and I love this from a legal pad where she wrote, "Would Roosevelt have been tried?" Which, of course, is the big question of Victor's justice. Could he, would he, should he have been tried for the crimes of the Allies? And the idea that she was asking big questions like that is really fascinating. Nonetheless, the newspaper articles again look at her as something unique and interesting solely because of her gender. They refer to her in this story and also quote to her companion on the staff side, right, the other woman at Farben, a woman named Mary Natalie Kaufman. She is also depicted next to Dr. Erna Krohn, and they are referred to in this newspaper caption as the two portions. Right? So there's always this grasping for the gender-related identification and explanation. I give you the picture of Erna Krohn now to introduce another nationality to the story. There were women defense counsel at Nuremberg. They were all Germans. This is probably, in my view, the most important one. Elizabeth Gombel, because she was the only woman to be a lead defense counsel at the trials. This was for Ernst Bola. She is also the only defense counsel to have pleaded her client guilty. In 1950s account of that trial written by an American author, this was seen as a sign of weakness. And he reports that she had got a guilty plea, and then he comments, this is a Mr. Appelman, effectively, she was too weak to go the distance of the trial, and that's why he pleaded guilty. In fact, he gets the lowest sentence of anybody, and it suggests that perhaps she was the shrewdest of the bunch. Most of the stories about her, including a CIA report from the 1950s that has been declassified, are most interested in the allegations that she was having an affair with her defendant, which may or may not be true. I haven't been able to confirm that, but there are allegations that after he was released, they lived together in Hamburg, and she's effectively supporting him because she's the successful lawyer and he's the convict who can't get a job. Another story I need to run down. Belzec gives a Shoah interview when she is 80 years old, and the piece of this that I'd like to leave with you is another angle that is becoming very interesting in my findings. She talks about what happened at the end of the trials. We're now talking late 1940s, early 1950s. She reports, as many of the participants do, that the Cold War may be what stopped the Nuremberg Project. She says, by the time we were finishing the trial, the US Congress is all set to fight Russia. The Nuremberg Project was an uncomfortable thing. We cooperated with the Soviets, after all. She says, and the House Un-American Committee accused the Farben prosecutors of being communist. I personally, she says, was accused of being a communist on the floor of Congress. She says, I took care of that in my own way. I got a retraction done through some friends. Well, that may or may not be true. She leaves government lawyering sometime in the 50s, as do many of these people. Why have we not heard about these women? Because many of them left public life. And I've identified 4 or 5 so far who appear to have left because they were found to be disloyal, in part because of their association with the Nuremberg Project. They also seem to have had some other traits that were of interest. They had Russian parents who had immigrated. They were Jewish, and they'd been interested in labor rights kind of groups before the war. So this is a piece that has not been much reported. Then, some of them, on the other hand, went on to be professors, judges, and other things. And so I haven't done the comparative work to figure out if there's a gender dynamic there, or were the investigators more likely to find them disloyal because women weren't supposed to be in the workplace anymore or not? I don't know, but that's a curious thing. Should also point out that at the same time, pro-West former Nurembergers were being kicked out of communist countries. And one of the interviews I read is a Bletchley woman who worked at Nuremberg and then goes and works for the British Council, which was the public diplomacy group, and gets thrown out of Czechoslovakia because they were too pro-West and very uncomfortable for the communists. So the Cold War is important. The very last person I want to talk to you about is Vivian Putty. She's a court reporter. Many of the women were court reporters. She reported not only aspects of the trial, including the doctor's trial or the medical trial, but also many of the interrogations. She wrote a book, as you can see this picture. She gives an interview to Shoah when she's 80 years old, and recalls much of the doctor's trial, in particular, the testimony of someone that she identifies as one young Polish woman. And this reminds us that there were women who were victims, and that their testimony at the trials was profoundly important. This is Władysława Karolewska, who was one of several Polish women, not Jewish, but resistance, who found themselves in the Ravensbrück prison because of their political dissidence, and who testified at the doctor's trial about the experiments that were done on them, medical experimentation. They testified not only with words, but many of them stood up and showed the scars on their body and were silent witnesses through their scars. Not surprisingly, this is one of the moments that Vivian Putty Spitz remembered most from that trial. She is so haunted, if you will, by that trial that she becomes, to my knowledge to date, the only Nuremberg woman to have written a memoir about her experiences. It's a book that was published not until 2010, called Doctors from Hell. As you can see, it's been published into many different languages. She also spoke, I don't know if it's something about having been the court reporter and having to do this to the testimony that made it both easier and more imperative for her to share her story, but she does. You'll see in the middle one that there are pictures of the many defendants at that trial. They omit the fact that, yes, there were 2 women defendants in the Nuremberg story as well. One was acquitted in a different trial. This one is the only woman convicted at Nuremberg. Her name is Dr. Herta Oberhäuser. She was a dermatologist and the chief medical officer at the Ravensbrück prison. And so she is identified in the trial by the woman that you just saw. Spitz talks about how matter-of-fact Oberhäuser was throughout all of this. But I must say that Spitz herself, like almost all of these witnesses when they're giving their testimony, are themselves incredibly matter-of-fact. And it's only toward the end of Spitz's interview that I realized that in the 2-hour segments they are almost biting their lips not to cry, as they are recounting and bringing back to the surface these memories, because of the ones I've watched so far, Spitz is the only one who does in fact eventually break down and cry. And she does so when she's talking about going home and being on a ship with many Jewish refugees from Czechoslovakia who initially refused to eat because there was no kosher food on the ship, and the captain finally finds a way to help them to eat, which is good because the voyage lasted for 12 days. And she reports that when we came into New York Harbor, and this is when she begins crying, all of the Jews were on deck at the sight of the Statue of Liberty. They all fell on their knees sobbing, and I was crying right with them. After one last pause, as we got to New York. And we had a German girl on board that ship who learned that I had reported on the Nuremberg trials. And she was adamant that it was all propaganda by the United States and the Allied countries. All propaganda, every bit of it. She was a young woman who might have been in her 30s at that time. So that was my first encounter with Holocaust denial, and I couldn't believe it. And yes, we must be reminded that Holocaust denial is itself another telling and another account. And the fact that it exists is perhaps yet another reason why it's important for us to keep excavating and keep telling and retelling these stories of law, justice, and legacy. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Diane, for this lecture. I open immediately the floor for questions. Maybe one clarification. I forwarded you the article of Leon Müller, but I received it from Michel, who is far more informed than me about Luxembourgish history. Maybe I can give him the mic. He might give some precisions to complement what you've said.
Oh, yeah. Thank you. Leon Müller worked for the United Nations War Crimes Commission at some point, helping them to collect evidence of war crimes in Luxembourg, in occupied Luxembourg. And yeah, as a matter of fact, she was present when the head of the German civil administration was brought to Luxembourg for a war crimes trial, and he mysteriously died. But and of course we still don't know how it happened, but we know that some people were pretty relieved when it happened, because he could also have revealed stuff. So, well, of course.
Yes, there may have been multiple motives.
Yes,
and not being the only one.
Yes, but Leon Müller was really interesting, because after the war she had an international career at the UN. She became a civil servant for the UN, and she died in New York. I mean, she spent the rest of her life there, there has not been, nobody has conducted real historical research on Leon Müller, I think, in Luxembourg, but I think that it might be interesting to pursue that, to do more research on her.
I agree, and thank you for introducing me. Perhaps we can talk later in the week, but my understanding is that she was somehow attached to the British Special Operations Executive, which is a secret service for foreign, non-British spies. There probably is some documentation of that. I wasn't able to confirm that through a web search, but that might be an avenue as well. Presumably their foreign office or other records about what she did during the war. But she appears to have had some involvement with the war crimes tribunals, rounding up accused or something of that nature.
Thank you. I wanted to ask first when and how you had decided to investigate more in depth this role of women in the Nuremberg trials.
Well, as you know, Hélène, because you are a co-contributor, I am the founder of the Info Girls blog, which was founded in 2007. As a place where women and a few men, we're up to about 500 women and 3 men as contributors, but one was Ban Ki-moon, so you could do worse. A place for us to begin to develop a virtual community, to write, etc. The question came up through Diane Marie of a picture that was found of one of these women. And we began investigating, and the few male prosecutors who were living professed not to remember that there were any women at Nuremberg, which is kind of surprising because one of them was actually the superior of the person who said that. I found a book at the Nuremberg gift shop that had a lot of pictures of women. The reason there are so many beautiful photos is that the Allies saw this as a positive propaganda opportunity and took footage and still photos in great number with the idea of using them for many years as evidence of the liberal democratic fair trial. The problem was the Soviet component. And so even the movie that they did, that they commissioned Bud Schulberg, who was also involved later in On the Waterfront, a major Hollywood person, that was his service in World War II. They commissioned him to do the documentary, and then they literally canned it for 50 years because they did not want a photographic reminder that Americans and Soviets had cooperated on a project. But it was that photographic evidence that got me to begin to look into it. And then I discovered people like Cecilia Gatz, who had these amazing careers, and it felt like something worth pursuing. Gatz was one of them whose papers had just surfaced. Her son donated them to a tiny Holocaust center on Long Island, New York. And I think other than the person who is still in the process of archiving them, I'm the only person who's seen them to date. One of the reasons that the personal papers are really important is that a number of these people wrote home, as people did then when there was no telephone or other way to communicate. One of the lawyers wrote home every single Sunday for the 4 months that she was there. And you have something like a contemporaneous diary. Selective in that it's what you're going to tell mom and dad that you've been doing, but nonetheless fairly contemporaneous about what's going on. And so those are really invaluable, both for just the texture of life. Please send me hair curlers, I can't find any here, right? On to more sophisticated things like, if anyone in the room knows about the story about the Nuremberg Charter, the State Department lawyer, who is a woman who writes at length to her father, who's a political science professor, about the problem with the semicolon in the Crimes Against Humanity account, which, if you're an insider, you know there was a real problem, but that's what she spends a paragraph on, is the problem about the semicolon and how stupid all the other lawyers are, because she saw it right away.
Professor Amann, thank you very much for your presentation. I find it absolutely fascinating. My name is Martina. I am a senior research fellow here, and I work a little bit in the field of international criminal law. And I wanted to pick your brain a little bit. You told us about all these, let's say, behind-the-scenes women, or the women things that we don't know about. But let's say with the small exception of maybe the defendants, nowadays international criminal justice is, has a more present amount of women, much more in the forcing of international criminal justice. I mean, even from the ICTY prosecutor, Calendar Pontap, to today's Fatou Bensouda at the ICC. Do you think, I suppose your research kind of makes you think sometimes, what does it mean for today? And my question was, do you think all these women that are now involved in international criminal justice shape it in a certain way because of the fact that they're women?
Well, that I think is an open question. I think, for me, one of the things that is important is not to jump to certain conclusions. I have read many theses that because we have women prosecutors, we have more prosecution of sexual violence in our conflict. I am not sure I believe in that cause and effect relationship. And so one of the reasons I was curious about what women at Nuremberg were thinking and doing is to see, well, did that hold out? If they had been the chief prosecutor instead of an underling, would there have been more explicit prosecutions of sexual violence? I'm not getting any evidence of that. My suspicion is it may have more to do about the moment in the history of international human rights and the interests of the NGO community in convergence with 1998 that may have as much to do with the salience of that particular issue in contemporary international criminal justice as the sex or gender of any particular prosecutor. I'd also note that those of us who are concerned about the place of women recognize that the second we say, well, we've got a women prosecutor now, we're done, we realize that backsliding occurs almost immediately if we aren't quite vigilant about it. And I have to say I have taken note of a Cambridge University Press book that is coming out this month called The Founders, as in the founders of 1990s and thereafter international criminal law. And it's a picture of a quartet of men, Ocampo, Crane, Goldstone, and Robert Petit. And they are depicted as the founders. And I think for anyone who is aware that there were women prosecutors, there have been many women judges, the NGOs are very heavily staffed by women who are very involved. It's a jarring picture, but it becomes now the CUP story of the founding of international criminal law in the 1990s. And so I'm not quite sure where we are in terms of progress or regress. Yes.
Thank you very much for this very interesting and inspiring lecture. I have a set of questions. My first question is, what about women from the former Soviet Union? Were they also in the Soviet team? What did they do? Were they visible? Do we know anything about them? I understood that most women maybe appeared in these trials as witnesses. Not so much on the side of the different teams which were dealing with all these crimes. And there is another side I would like to ask you. I'm German. And
As am
what about the German women, the German wives of the accused? I know there were networks even among the former or still Nazis.
Right.
And we know from Hans Frank and his wife and how it worked. And so this is certainly also an interesting side of the story to be told. And I know, for instance, that the widow of Keitel remained a Nazi all her lifetime, and she was always in these networks. Ulrich Herbert has very interesting stories about this. And my last question is a totally different one. Now we are 75 years after the trials, more or less. Does research change without living witnesses? You showed some.
Does what change?
Research change without having access to living witnesses, maybe only children who heard it by hearsay. Hearsay is extremely important in this context. So I would like to learn from you how you see this.
So let's go through those. I would love to know more about the Soviets as well. I do not have Russian. There is a woman named Francine Hirsch who is a history professor at the University of Wisconsin. She's written a couple chapters or articles, but is in the process of writing a book called The Soviets in Nuremberg. I believe that the archives were declassified not long ago, and she's been deep into them. So at some point I will consult with her on this, although I don't expect that it will be a huge part of this project because it would be so far out of my own ken. I could simply not go into the depth I have with the subjects I've mentioned with the Soviets. It would be interesting that the pictures show that women were not prominent, although there were definitely women as, in all the courtroom pictures, there are women in the back row. And we all assume they're the secretaries, but many of them turn out to have been the lawyers in the American context. So we don't know yet what the role was of women. We have a sense that in the World War II Soviet era, that women may have been more egalitarian and had more opportunities, but perhaps not in the law. Hard to say. Perhaps not in the military at these levels. Hard to say. Even as to the other allies, there were many more American women at many more different roles, and I don't think that was only because Nuremberg was in the American zone. That said, virtually all the women lawyers who were German had PhDs. And that suggests that Germany before World War II did have some opportunities for some women. I think there must have been many more PhDs than one would have found in the United States at the time. Most of these women who were lawyers were one of two or three at most in their classes. Harvard, Yale did not admit women at this time. This is one of the class and education issues. Why is it that some of the men went on to be law professors? Well, because they graduated from Harvard. And the women were lucky to get admitted to Fordham or St. John's or something like that. So even today, if you start out with those degrees, you can predict who's more likely to become the law professor regardless of the The British appear to have no women lawyers whatsoever, at all, as far as I can tell. Many women, and that's why I'm focusing on these women who were the code breakers and working in the intelligence aspects, because I think that's the British female story. That, and there's a wonderful Shoah interview with a woman who was, could you imagine, the nurse to the defendants at the Dachau trial. She was a British Red Cross nurse, and that was her assignment, was to deal with their maladies. It turns out, and this again reminds us of the time, what everyone wanted was aspirin. There was very little aspirin, let alone any other kind of painkiller. And you hear even people on the street, they weren't asking for chewing gum, they were asking for aspirin. If you think about it, anything that would sort of dull your senses must have been very attractive to everybody at that time. So the British appear perhaps to have been the least advanced vis-a-vis women in this area. There is one French woman whom I've identified, in whom I'm very deeply interested and hope to find someone who has some French connections who can help me investigate more. Her name is Aline Chalouffour. She is identified as early as July of 1945, before the trial starts, as being part of the French delegation. She had a doctorate. She had graduated from the Sorbonne. I find her she had been in Indochina and thrown out when the Japanese took over what's now Vietnam. She has a big job with Margaret Mead at one point. She ends up working for de Gaulle and the Free French as a propagandist in Ottawa, Canada, throughout the war, and then makes her way to Nuremberg, and stays for 5 years, and eventually ends up the only French prosecutor and the only woman prosecutor, to my knowledge, in a British trial. She is one of the top 3 lawyers at the British Ravensbrück trial. So I'm very interested in her, but I haven't been able to. She doesn't appear on the net very much. So I don't know how or why or what exactly she did. As to the German women who were partners of the accused, I think I will probably not go very deeply into that. There's a fair bit written. Wendy Lauer has a wonderful book called Hitler's Furies, which is not quite about this slice of German women, but it's about women, stereotypical farm girl from somewhere in Germany who sees adventure in becoming a school teacher in the Aryanization preschools in occupied Ukraine, or something like that, and becomes very much part of the Nazi project, if you will, during occupation. There is another book called The Witness House. I think it was originally published in German, but the American name is The Witness House, by a woman named Ingeborg Kalnaki, who I think had been Hungarian or Romanian, aristocrat who ends up running the boarding house that the Americans ran for the Nazi German witnesses, including Hitler's photographer Hoffman. And so she has a book, and some of the people, Louisa Jodl, Baldur von Schirach's wife and daughter, I think, are people who come in and out of that story. One of the huge challenges of this project will be to maintain boundaries, because I don't want to be the person who comes to you 20 years from now and says, I'm getting there, I'm almost there, you'll see the book soon. And so I've kind of decided to really put some confines on how deeply I'm going to look and declare it done before the entire project's finished. I don't know whether I would write a second book, but hopefully it will become a tantalizer for others to pursue some of the research beyond what I'm able to do. There's a similar fascinating story of the Tokyo trial, as I've seen just from FX and blog posts that were done, but I am not going to touch the Tokyo trials.
Yes, thank you. Marco Benetta, Research Fellow here at MPI. I'd like to ask you two questions. My first is about your comment. I hope I didn't mishear that there were 2 women defendants at Nuremberg, and you spoke about one. So who was the other one? Is there anything interesting to say about her? And then my second question, but it might be moot now, I wanted to ask you about Tokyo trials. I watched a show on Netflix called Tokyo Trial.
Right, the Dutch
Yes,
one, yeah.
That's the one, which is a good show.
Which is also has male heroes.
That's
Happen to be Dutch, but yes.
exactly. And so as you were speaking, I was thinking about the show because I thoroughly enjoyed it. And I can only remember 2 women from the show. One was the potential love interest, and I don't know if that was made up, maybe you know. And the second is that there was always a woman who was present during the hearings because she was the interpreter for the Soviet judge, if I'm not mistaken. So I just want to know if there's anything that you know now. I know it's not the focus of your research, but any interesting parallels that you can draw. Thank you very much.
Okay, and the first one was about women defendants. So I showed you Dr. Oberhäuser. There is another story about her that's vastly interesting. She is convicted and sentenced to a term of years, not a lot. This was also part of the Cold War story. Almost all of the people who were still in jail by around 1952 had their sentences commuted. And virtually no one was serving, regardless of what they had been convicted of after 1955, because the Americans wanted to shut the whole thing down. Those were executed, obviously out of luck. But Oberhäuser, as a result, is out by the early 50s. She returns to the practice of medicine in Germany as a pediatrician. Eventually, she is found out by survivors of the Holocaust who raised such a stink about it that Germany pulls her license and strips her of the ability to practice medicine. But just the hubris of her returning to that practice is quite extraordinary. The other person was a woman named Inga Wernitz. She was in what was called the Shoah trial, which was the Race and Settlement Administration Lebensborn program, the forced adoptions of children. She was the secretary to one of the male defendants, and the judges were persuaded that she was not sufficiently involved in the criminality that they acquitted her. I should say another way I'm drawing boundaries is I'm not going to cover all 13 trials. It would be far too much, and people like Kevin Heller have written wonderful books about all of those, so there are other sources to consult. I think that I will talk about the principal trial, probably the ministry's trial, which is where the Wannsee Protocol becomes so important. There's also an American woman lawyer important in that trial, Farben, both because of the women and because many of the workers in the Farben plants were women. There are a lot of stories about that. And then doctors, prosecutions, and we'll probably look not only at the Nuremberg Military Tribunal doctors trial, but at least the Ravensbrück trial as well, because that brings in Aline Schaller. They were happening simultaneously, and it was almost an arbitrary dividing of defendants as to these two. So I think it made it interesting, and of course we see there are powerful female witnesses in that story as well as defendants. So I don't think I will do the Russia trial. She'll end up a footnote, that other defendant. As for the Tokyo trials, I haven't watched the whole Netflix series yet. I watched a couple episodes. The only woman with whom I am at all familiar is named Grace Kanode, K-A-N-O-D-E, half Japanese, ancestry American, who was it? She may be the first American woman to have made a court appearance in any of the post-war trials. She was a real courtroom prosecutor. I'm assuming she had Japanese, but I may just be guessing on that. She had been a lawyer, as many of these were, she had been a lawyer in Washington. Why was that the pattern? Because the male lawyers in Washington, bureaucracy had gone to war. And so suddenly World War II, the federal bureaucracy was a great opening for women lawyers in America because there were just enough of them graduating. The ones who were able to get in usually were stars. Both Cecilia Getz and Harriet Zetterberg were #1 in their class at NYU and Wisconsin respectively, and they were both the first woman editor-in-chief of the law review at their law schools. So for those kind of women, there was an entry, and they're able to segue in. Grace Knob was somewhere in that story. I don't know anything about any other women at the trial.
You told us that you had been able to watch a lot of the recording of interviews of survivors, of people who had taken part in all these events. In terms of methodology, I mean, you also told us that you had to learn how to read a photo in a way. Could you expand a bit on this and what you have learned? As a lawyer, I mean, it could be interesting to have some insights about all these unusual
this
methodologies.
This evolved into a really counterintuitive and counter-traditional methodology, and that's of necessity. If I were to start with the primary and secondary literature, I would learn very little about women in Nuremberg. The judgments say nothing except in the victim circumstance, and even then, there's very little gender distinction as to victims. Some of the other primary governmental things, there are some reports that Justice Jackson and Telford Taylor, the two American prosecutors, do to Congress and the US government that purport to list everyone who mattered in, say, the prosecution team. You do start seeing women's names there, but in footnote capacity, not at all explaining what they do, often in the nature of other people helping with this brief work. And we don't know if helping means they drafted it or they proofread it or they typed it. I should say that as to Aline Chalafour, Telford Taylor's memoir, which is one, if anyone is interested in Nuremberg, that is a must-read book, mentions her once as an administrator in the French delegation whom I got to know very well because she had such impeccable English. She, in fact, was a lawyer and worked as a lawyer, and the woman State Department lawyer who befriends her understands from the very beginning, at the same time Telford Taylor is deciding she's an administrator, that she's a lawyer. So she probably was doing the chief of staff kind of work, but he couldn't see her as a lawyer at all. So if you read his memoir, you'd have no idea there was a French woman lawyer involved at all. As a result, if I were only to look at those traditional sources, the men's memoirs, Telford Taylor's memoir, I just went through it yesterday, went through the index, every mention of a woman, almost all of them are in a sexual or romantic context. Very, very few exceptions, right? So you would not have anything to talk about. And what I discovered is I'm going to have to get at it a different way. And I found the Cecilia Getz Shoah interview just through an online search. And then I found out that the USC Shoah Foundation had research fellowships, and so I was able to spend a month there. Their database is immense, and not everything is online. And so some of them you can only access by going there. And it was just delightful to discover there were something like 24 interviews that were incredibly important. It was in the course of going through those that my methodology really changed. And so it is basically what I'm doing is I'm trying to find papers and oral histories that begin to map and identify on the timeline what women's roles were at various times, what women were involved in various trials, what they did, what their relationships were. And then I will go back to what is supposedly the primary stuff and look more carefully at it, but with targeted dates. So now I know the Polish woman testified on date X. I I can go there to the transcript and assess it myself. It would be impossible to read the thousands and thousands and thousands of pages of transcripts of these. I simply don't have that many lifetimes in me. And so it's kind of going that direction. Same thing, Robert Jackson's papers, Dr. Taylor's papers go on for shelves and shelves and shelves. Much of it is irrelevant to me because they so ignore the women. But now I know from a letter, I told Telford, we should prosecute this way. I can go to the date or the month in which that conversation or memo supposedly was prepared and find it, rather than trying to find it like a needle in a haystack. I will say, in answer to your question, I think we will find that the trials might have been litigated differently by the women. One of the findings that's alleged in one of the oral histories is that Balzac, as they were preparing Farben, tried to persuade her male superior, who was the chief trial counsel, not to start with the aggressive war count, because it was so boring to put on. It was solely documentary. By the time of the subsequent trials, they had judges from the state courts in the US who didn't even know complex litigation, let alone international law, had never been overseas, were very much out of their depth, and they were stultified by days and months of introduction of documents and affidavits on a concept of aggressive war that they did not even comprehend. And what she said, watching that in another trial as they were preparing for Farben, she said, we should start with the slave labor and live witnesses and grab these judges' attention and get them to understand really what was at stake. And Mayo said, no, we can't do it that way. That's not how we do these cases. So one wonders whether some of these judgments would have been different if there had been, if you will, a more dramatic presentation of the evidence as time had already passed, the war was over, people's interest levels were different. Would that have changed the outcome if the judges had become enthralled with the criminality that was at stake rather than deadened and numbed by document after document having to be translated badly before they had said it. So I think some of that will come out, but I can only find that through the oral histories because what is left in the paper record doesn't include a lot of that. And so that's part of the reading, right? Even if there's a paragraph or a footnote, without Zetterberg's husband telling me she's not tired, she's angry there, you simply wouldn't see it.
Yes, thank you so much for your talk. I was wondering, talking about methodologies and also about the remark made by Professor S on the progressive disappearance of witnesses. If we think in terms of long-term impact of the trial, we could even consider the next generations. What do I mean? In Belgium, I do work with historians and clinicians and social psychologists on the 3 generations after war in terms of memory transmission, and we compare grandchildren of collaborators in Flanders and Belgium and grandchildren of resistance in Flanders and Belgium, because there is much at stake in terms of national identity, of lack of national identity in Belgium, whatever. But my point is that it's so interesting to see that it's not only a question of transmission of a specific narrative from a generation to another one, but more interestingly, I think it's a question of transmission of emotions, and sometimes without the text. And then we can realize whether 3 generations afterwards, people are still talking about guilt, shame, grief, hatred, resentment, and so on, even if they don't know why, but it's still there. And I was wondering, maybe it could be interesting to contact, I don't know, the great, if you have 10 people you want to focus on in your book, it wouldn't be so difficult to find 3 generations afterwards, people still in life, and I don't know, just a
Yeah, absolutely, thank you, and I didn't answer that aspect of it. I think part of what I'm trying to convey is that this story will change and its meaning will change constantly. It's quite, so Edith Colliver, Simon Colliver, is one of the people who does 2 different interviews at 2 different points. She's 75 in one and 77 in the other. She's really old and tired in the second one. And she's much vaguer, and it's a different interview than the first one, even when she's telling the same anecdote. Some of these folks, Vivian Spitz is one that I showed you, there are others, gave many, many talks to school groups and things. In order to do those talks, they read. And so their memory is not only their memory anymore. It's quite clear that they're filling in the blanks with what they read from other people. So they're not authentic in a pure sense, if there is such a thing, right? And so I think the fact that these folks aren't alive anymore, I think it's wonderful that Shoah and other groups preserved them as they are, because there is emotion and something in seeing them and hearing them. But as how we understand it will change, how the story is told will change. What, if anything, they told their families will depend on their attitude toward it, the age that they were when they were asked, and what looked interesting. Some of them who talked a lot of times to different groups, it's clear they're choosing the anecdotes that got the most chuckles or something, right? And for me, they weren't always the most interesting, but they were used to talking to an audience, and so they began to revise their story according to what was going to get the most audience response. I do intend to probably winnow this down to about 6 people who are the primary characters, 5 or 6, as you said. That's still too many, but I don't think I can get it much below that unless I write a different kind of book. And I do have the ability to contact many family members, but until I've made that choice, I'm not going to go in that direction because, again, the scope would get too large, and also I don't want to be in a position of talking to a child or a grandchild and then not using it, right? That they would feel not only not using their interview, but say cutting their grandmother entirely from the narrative. I know journalists do that all the time, but the less that I have to do that, I think, the better. But at some point I will do that. Some of them never talked about it, right? So that's interesting too. Did they talk? When did they talk? What did they talk about? The Bletchley people were not permitted by the Official State Secrets Act to talk about what they did in World War II until the 70s or 80s. And so their children probably knew nothing about this because they had been forbidden to talk about it.
For those who know the Max Planck Institute, we have a kind of steady pace out of lectures with a nice drink waiting for us outside, a way to go smoothly to a more informal discussion. But before opening the door, I would like to thank very much Diane for this I wouldn't say exciting lecture, because the topic does not invite such a qualification, but at the same time lecture will provide food for thought and invites to go on with the dialogue, and this is what we will do. Thank you very much.